Ladies and gentlemen, are you being deceived? Do you know Satan's tactics? Well, one problem with being deceived is you don't know you're being deceived, because if you knew, you wouldn't be deceived. We're going to talk about what I think is an extremely profound insight from C.S. Lewis on that. But before I get into that, I want to mention we just got back last week from Wayne State University in Detroit. And it was a very good session we had, so much so that Dr. Bruce Russell, who had been teaching philosophy at Wayne State University since 1978, he's an atheist. He showed up and we had a dialogue during the Q&A. It happens about 1 hour and 54 minutes in. So it's during the Q&A, after the presentation. So if you go to YouTube and you want to see that, I enjoyed interacting with Dr. Russell, and we actually spoke a little bit afterwards as well. And I think you'll enjoy the exchange. I'll leave it to you to see who was closer to the truth in our little exchange. He's an atheist. Of course, I'm giving the Christian viewpoint, and we talked a little bit about the grounding of morality and mathematics and logic and that kind of thing. So I appreciate Dr. Russell for showing up. We had a bunch of other questions as well. So check out the YouTube of Wayne State University. Also very interesting that Dr. Geisler, my mentor, that's the school he went to get his bachelor's degree, Wayne State University. I think that was his bachelor's degree. Anyway, it's right in the heart of Detroit, Michigan. And we had a nice turnout there. Probably about 300 showed up. And we peaked out at about 17,000 watching on our X account, our Twitter account. So we're trying to get the word out when we're doing these events, so people can see the argument for Christianity and see all the Q&A that we do. And thank you for those of you that support us, because when we go to a college campus, we don't charge students a dime, and we stream it all as well. So the donors to crossexamine.org are paying for that. No students pay for it. It's free to everyone. So if you want to donate, go to crossexamine.org, click on donate. All right, I want to get into today something I didn't get into a couple of podcasts ago. I intended to, but I think one of the most profound letters of the Screwtape Letters is actually the first one. And it talks about Satan's tactics, how demons try and get you to believe something that's false. And the way they do it is not with argument. It's done with slogans, with jargon, with propaganda, with appealing to your pride rather than argument. So let me read this first letter. It's very profound in my mind anyway. And for those of you that don't know the Screwtape Letters were Lewis's attempt to show how demons tempt human beings. And these letters are written from the chief demon to a junior demon called Wormwood. And so when you're reading these letters, everything is kind of reverse. The enemy, when he speaks of the enemy, that's God, okay? Our father down below is Satan, that kind of thing. So let me read this, and I'll comment on it as we go. I think it has some great insights for us. So the senior demon writes, "My dear Wormwood, I note what you say about guiding our patients reading," and I got to stop here because I didn't set that up right. A patient is one of us. The demons in Lewis's world call people that the demons are trying to tempt patients. Okay, like a patient in a hospital. Okay, my dear Wormwood, easy for me to say. My dear Wormwood, I note what you say about guiding our patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you supposed that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. Again, enemy God, out of God's clutches. That might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still pretty knew well when a thing was proved and when it was not. And if it was proved, they really believed it. They still connected thinking with doing and were prepared to alter their way of life as a result of a chain of reasoning. But what with the weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. Your man has been accustomed ever since he was a boy to have a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside his head. He doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or ruthless. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Let me stop right here. This is such a wonderful insight. Lewis here is saying, in ancient times, people weren't distracted by all the distractions we have today. Now, when Lewis was writing this, of course, there was no internet, there were no iPhones, that kind of thing. We have even more distractions now, but he was saying the weekly press, the idea that there's a newspaper every day or just even every week, or the TV or the radio, these are things that can distract us from the truth. And people didn't have those kind of distractions centuries ago. They were more likely to try and just find the truth and not be distracted by all of these other philosophies that maybe they've never even heard of. Okay, so here Lewis is saying, don't try and argue your patient away from Jesus. You got to use jargon to keep him away from Jesus. He goes on to say, don't waste time trying to make him think that materialism is true. Make him think it is strong or stark or courageous, that it is the philosophy of the future. That's the sort of thing he cares about. Stop right here for a second. When Satan appeals to our pride, like, wow, you're so progressive, you're so contemporary, you're so in the know, you're the kind of person that other people will look up to because you've dispensed with all that ancient miracle nonsense. You're your own man or your own woman. You don't need anybody telling you what to do. You're brave. You're a bright, as the atheists used to say, the new atheists. We're the brights. We are the ones who are bravely blazing a new path and dispensing with all this medieval superstition. The book written by illiterate goat herders, right? We're the real progressive and brave and forward-thinking people. That kind of jargon, that really gets people to think, yeah, I want to be part of that group. I want to be part of the brights. I want to be part of the rebels throwing off the constraints, or as one of the Psalms says, I think it might be Psalm 2, that the psalmist says, why do the nations conspire basically against God? They want to throw off God's fetters. They want to do their own thing. That's just an appeal to pride, ladies and gentlemen. That's just an appeal to our personal narcissism. We want to think that we're the authority and that whatever we think is right and true. So Lewis is absolutely correct about this. And use jargon, not argument. In our contemporary culture, jargon would be things like love is love and my body, my choice, and equity and inclusion and tolerance and diversity and all this jargon that doesn't mean what you think it means. I mean, DEI really isn't about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's about using new racism or new sexism to try and correct old racism or old sexism or whatever it is. Use jargon, not argument, says Lewis says. He goes on to say this: the trouble about argument is that it involves or that it moves the whole struggle into the enemy's ground. In other words, onto God's own ground. He can argue too, says the demon. Whereas in really practical propaganda of the kind I am suggesting, he He has been shown for centuries to be greatly the inferior of our Father below. By the very act of arguing, you awake the patient's reason. And once it is awake, who can foresee the result? Even if a particular train of thought can be twisted so as to end in our favor, you will find that you have been strengthening in your patient the fatal habit of attending to universal issues and withdrawing his attention from the stream of immediate sense experiences. Your business is to fix his attention on the stream. Again, ladies and gentlemen, Lewis wrote this long before there was an iPhone or internet or 500 TV channels or a million YouTube distractions or Netflix. They didn't have any of this, but they still had this stream of immediate sense experiences that prevented people from really stopping, reflecting, and thinking on what is true. And so this demon is saying, don't get them thinking. If they get thinking, there's going to be trouble. They may go to the enemy's camp. They may become Christians, in other words. Lewis goes on to write, teach him to call it real life, and don't let him ask what he means by real. Remember, he is not like you, a pure spirit, never having been a human. Oh, that abominable advantage of the enemies, because Jesus became a human. You don't realize how enslaved they are to the pressure of the ordinary. The pressure of the ordinary. And Lewis is going to describe what he means by this here. He says, or the demon, senior demon says, I once had a patient, a sound atheist, who used to read in the British Museum. One day, as he sat reading, I saw a train of thought in his mind beginning to go the wrong way. The enemy, of course, was at his elbow in a moment. Before I knew where I was, I saw my 20 years' work beginning to totter. If I had lost my head and begun to attempt a defense by argument, I should have been undone. But I was not such a fool. I struck instantly at the part of the man which I had best under my control and suggested that it was just about time he had some lunch. So he's trying to distract him from thinking. That's what the demon's doing here. The demon goes on to say, the enemy presumably made the counter suggestion. You know how one can never quite overhear what he says to them. That this was more important than lunch. At least I think that must have been his line for when I said quite, in fact, much too important to tackle it at the end of the morning. The patient brightened up considerably, and by the time I had added much better come back after lunch and go into it with a fresh mind, he was already halfway out the door. Once he headed to the street, the battle was won. I showed him a newsboy shouting the midday paper and a number 73 bus going past, and before he reached the bottom of the steps, I had got him into an unalterable conviction that whatever odd ideas might come into a man's head when he was shut up alone with his books, a healthy dose of real life, by which he meant the bus and the newsboy, was enough to show him all that sort of thing just couldn't be true. He is now safe in our Father's house. Unquote. Wow. Yeah, because the ordinariness of life just kind of dulls our senses to the miraculous, to the amazing things going on all around us. And when I say miraculous, I don't mean in the biblical sense, because these things happen all the time, like the birth of a baby, or just a conversation with somebody else. How does that even take place? Having a conversation with somebody. How are you conscious? How is somebody else conscious? Do we ever stop and think about those things? How are we even communicating with one another right now? How are you understanding what I'm saying? Assuming you are. How are you even thinking about things if everything's just molecules in motion, as the materialists say? Well, there's something more than just molecules in motion. The love of someone else, the birth of a new baby, the transcendence you feel when you see a certain thing, hear a certain song, have a certain experience. You know, it's more than just molecules bumping into one another. But if we just go through life without stopping and reflecting on those things, you can easily think this is all just molecules bumping into one another. These are all just natural causes. There is no supernatural. The ordinariness of life can lull us into a sense that maybe atheism's really true. Now, of course, if we're just molecules in motion, as we've said 1,000 times on this program, you should have no warrant to believe anything you think, including the thought that atheism's true. Because if you're not reasoning, you're just reacting. Why believe anything? Well, you can believe things you think, which means there's got to be an explanation for that. And the explanation is not atheism. The explanation is not molecules bumping into one another. Anyway, Lewis goes on to say, after he talks about trying to get people to stay in the ordinariness of things, to not really reflect on anything, he says, you begin to see the point? Thanks to the processes which we set at work in them centuries ago, they find it all but impossible to believe in the unfamiliar while the familiar is before their eyes, unquote. Exactly. You know, we can't believe in miracles because all we see is natural causes around us, and they're ordinary. We never stop to think, well, in order for miracles to be identified, natural laws must be the cause for most of the ordinary things going on around us, number one. I mean, if miracles were just as prevalent as natural events, we'd say, well, these are natural events too. They wouldn't get our attention. Also, miracles have to be extremely rare if they're going to have their intended effect to say, wow, this is a special act that points back to God. If miracles occurred all the time, they would lose their apologetic value. I mean, imagine if resurrections occurred all the time. What would the resurrection of Christ mean to us? Nothing. You go to somebody and you go, hey, Jesus rose from the dead to prove he was God. And the guy goes, so what? Uncle George just rose from the dead 2 weeks ago. Now I got to give the inheritance back. No, it's got to be a rare event if it's going to get our attention. The problem is that we tend to think when we see so many natural events that there are no supernatural events. That just doesn't follow. Natural events must far outnumber supernatural events if supernatural events are going to have their intended effect when they're done. But we can't just rule them out because they are so prevalent. Anyway, Lewis goes on to say this. Keep pressing home on him the ordinariness of things. Above all, do not attempt to use science, I mean the real sciences, as a defense against Christianity. They will positively encourage him to think about realities he can't touch and see. There have been sad cases among the modern physicists. If he must dabble in science, keep him on economics and sociology. Don't let him get away from that invaluable real life. But best of all is to let him read no science, but to give him a grand general idea that he knows it all and everything he happens to have picked up in casual talk and reading is the results of modern investigation. Do you remember how you are to fuddle them? From the way some of you young fiends talk, anyone would suppose it was our job to teach. And that's the end of the letter, your affectionate Uncle Screwtape. Notice he says in here, there have been sad cases among the physicists. Why? Because once you start thinking about the physical world and the fact that it had a beginning and that it's fine-tuned, you start going, oh, there's got to be a beginner and a fine-tuner out there. Okay, so keep him on these other sciences, the softer sciences, economics and sociology, but not the hard sciences. That's going to cause him to start thinking there's something beyond this world. And it's not, as he says here at the end, it's the demon's job is not to teach you. The demon's job is to deceive you, to try and get you to believe that you're courageous and you're a liberator and that you're somebody that's progressive and you're your own man or your own woman. We got to dispense with this silly belief in a God, in a sky daddy, that kind of thing. They want to mock you to make you think you can't believe what the Bible says. You wouldn't be sophisticated if you did. So use jargon, use slogans. Don't let people, don't give them a chance to start really reflecting on what's going on around them and how amazing it is. Yes, the world is ordinary, but it's also amazing. When you just stop and think about things that are going on around you right now. In fact, as I said earlier, our very conversation is amazing. The fact that we can communicate, the fact that there's immaterial laws of logic and there's universals out there that we can all grasp and be able to communicate with one another. Not to mention the beautiful creation and design around us and the moral law within. That's going to get you to think about things beyond just molecules in motion. I mean, the atheists can't even explain where the molecules came from. And to say everything's molecules, love isn't molecules in motion, justice isn't molecules in motion, morality isn't molecules in motion, logic isn't molecules in motion, mathematics isn't molecules in motion, consciousness isn't molecules in motion. There's so many things that aren't molecules in motion that can't be explained completely by them. And yet we rarely stop and think about that. So that's Screwtape letter number 1. And I think you'd really enjoy the whole book if you haven't read Screwtape Letters yet, but that one really hit me right off the bat as soon as I read it. I want to talk about a couple other things as well today. As you've noticed in our country, there's been a lot of judge activity. District court judges claiming that what President Trump is doing is somehow unconstitutional, and they know better. All right, let me say right off the top that sometimes judges are right and sometimes judges are wrong. And there is a bit of a ambiguity in our laws, because it may surprise you to learn that the United States Constitution does not give the judiciary the right explicitly to declare certain laws constitutional and other laws not constitutional. It was the court itself that gave itself that particular duty in Marbury versus Madison, a case that went back to the early 1800s. The problem is that if they look at themselves as guardians of the Constitution, who is going to guard the guardians of the Constitution? Why do we say that the judges have the final say, or even the Supreme Court? Now, technically, our government is not 3 co-equal branches. Our government has 3 branches, and tragically, or probably not the right word, but unfortunately, there's a 4th branch that actually President Trump has been going after, the administrative branch, all these agencies that really appear to be accountable to almost no one, like USAID, part of the State Department. And so he's been trying to say there's so much waste here, we've got to scale this back. But we're supposed to have 3 branches of government: the legislative, the judiciary, and of course the executive with the president. Technically, the legislative branch is the most powerful because the legislative branch can impeach the other 2 branches. So the Congress can impeach a president, Congress can impeach judges. In our country, however, our population is so evenly split, that ability to impeach just never works anymore, it seems, because we're so evenly split. So now a judge can basically do what he wants or she wants, it seems, unless the Supreme Court is ultimately going to overturn them. And this happened just recently with regard to the president's decision to say that transgender people are not qualified to serve in the military. And a district court judge in the District of Columbia, she's actually was born in Uruguay, but is an American lawyer. This is according to her Wikipedia page. Her name is Anna Cecilia Reyes. She served as United States District Judge of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, a lot of districts in there, since 2023. She was nominated to the position by President Joe Biden and is both the first Latina and, wait for it, openly LGBT person to serve as a district court judge in Washington, D.C. Now, this doesn't mean she's not qualified, but it would seem that she might have wanted to have recused herself from this case because it has to do with what she considers to be her identity, or at least an identity that is affiliated with her. She's claiming to be a lesbian. Well, not claiming, she says she is, okay? And here is part of her opinion. She says this: the president has the power, indeed the obligation, to ensure military readiness. At times, however, leaders have used concern for military readiness to deny marginalized persons the privilege of serving. So then she has, quote, blank is not fully capable and would hinder combat effectiveness. Blank, like fill in the blank, will disrupt unit cohesion and so diminish military effectiveness. Allowing blank to serve will undermine training, make it impossible to recruit successfully, and disrupt military order. First minorities, then women in combat, then gays filled in that blank. Today, however, our military is stronger and our nation is safer for the millions of such blanks and all other persons who serve. Okay, first of all, the question before her is whether or not this policy is constitutional or not. And she goes on for 79 pages to try and say, well, this is unconstitutional. For Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, and President Trump to say this group of people can't serve in the military. Let me say right off the bat, and I don't know if she seems to understand this. I mean, I assume she's a smart woman, but the way she writes, she assumes that people have a right to serve in the military, although she puts it a privilege. There is no right to serve in the United States military. There are mental and physical standards that you must meet. And even if you meet those standards, the military is not obligated to take you. It is not an equal opportunity employer, although they may try and say they are. There are standards you need to meet. And your behavior and your physical and mental condition can disqualify you in the military more so than most civilian jobs, although there may be comparable civilian jobs like airline pilots, that kind of thing. But to suggest that there's a right to serve in the military and that all people groups have to be open or have to be given the privilege to serve in the military, I think is false. I can't serve in the military anymore. I'm too old. I served for 8 years when I was, when did I start? When I was like 22 to about 30, early 30s. Okay, right out of college, served for 8 years in the United States Navy, which stands for Never Again Volunteer Yourself. Anyway, so I didn't have a right. In fact, I had to meet standards. They didn't have to take me, but I met the standards and they decided to take me. And I remember in 1984 going to Pensacola, Florida for navigator school training, flight training. And one of the first things we had to do in Pensacola, this is 41 years ago, was make sure that we were physically fit. We had to go through an obstacle course. We had to run certain distance at a certain time. We had to do so many push-ups, so many sit-ups. And I never forget the obstacle course. There were 2 obstacle courses. There was a male obstacle course and a female obstacle course, and they were right next to one another, and they were dramatically different. Wait a minute. Wait, why are they different? Why should they be different? If you're saying that you've got to do certain things to qualify physically, why don't the women have to go over the same wall the men have to go over? Well, you could say, well, maybe we're going to put women in jobs that don't require that kind of physical ability. Okay, fair. Then you can have 2 obstacle courses. But that doesn't mean that men and women can necessarily do the same thing in the military. Despite the fact that we like to say to people, you can do whatever you want. a woman can do everything a man can do? The statement is demonstrably false. Okay, sorry. That's just the way biology is. I didn't make it up. I'm not the creator. I'm just telling you that men, as we can see with now men and women's sports, there's just a race the other day where, there was a young man in a high school meet. I think it was a 400-meter race. He beat the women by 7 seconds. Okay, usually a 400 comes down to fractions of a second or a second or two at most. In any event, the point here is you don't have a right to serve in the military. The military has certain standards that you must meet. And to suggest that the president and the Secretary of Defense don't have a right to establish those standards, I think is judicial overreach. In fact, this woman writes in her opinion, she's referring to a previous case. Plaintiffs in this case are the transgender people trying to overturn the ban. Plaintiffs in Trump versus Hawaii, which was a case back in, I think, 2018, challenged it as a violation of the Establishment Clause because the case had to do with keeping certain people out of the country, particularly Muslims, alleging that it was motivated not by concerns pertaining to national security, but by animus toward Islam. And they were successful. The court said, it was animus toward Islam, so Trump couldn't keep those people out. All right. Here, this is another problem. This is like jargon here. This is jargon, and this is not good thinking. Because animus toward Islam should be irrelevant. The motivation or state of mind of the lawmaker is not the issue. The issue is the constitutionality of the law. You can have all sorts of different motivations to try and put a law in place. The motivation behind the law isn't the issue. What's the issue is whether or not the law is constitutional, meets constitutional muster. You can have all sorts of different reasons for putting a law in place. And this idea of animus toward Islam, let me put that another way. It's more in common parlance called Islamophobia. Ladies and gentlemen, Islam is a behavior. Islam is not a race. Islam is an ideology. And the president might have good reasons for not wanting certain people in the country who harbor an ideology that is 180 degrees out from the United States Constitution. In other words, he may want to keep people out that want to overthrow the United States government or overthrow the United States Constitution or bring bodily harm to Americans. And that's another thing, of course, going on now in our culture. We've got judges telling the president that he can't deport certain people. This all needs to be taken under advisement. I'm not saying judges don't have a role here. I just think this judge in this particular case is out over her skis, and she could have recused herself. She goes on to talk about how there's animus and disparagement of transgender people in the order to say that transgender people cannot serve in the military. What do you mean disparagement? To say that people who are on cross-sex hormones or puberty blockers or have gotten surgery don't meet physical and mental standards. That's not disparagement. That just happens to be the truth. And so to just classify that as disparagement, it's more like jargon. It's more like saying, well, you have to be nice. You have to be kind. You can't call out things that we know are true, but might be upsetting to some people. This is not good jurisprudence. In fact, Anthony Kennedy, who was on the Supreme Court, used animus in his decision that imposed same-sex marriage on the entire nation. That these laws that are trying to keep marriage between a man and a woman, because that's what it is, because the reason the government's involved in marriage is to perpetuate and stabilize society, which only biological two-parent marriage does, or man-woman marriage does. He said, well, to try and keep marriage just to a man and a woman is animus. It's not motivated. It's not motivated by animus, but even if it was, that's not the job of the court. The court is to see whether something's constitutional or not to get into the head of a lawmaker who might have a certain motivation, unless that motivation pertains to its constitutionality, which in many cases does not. You might want to figure out what the motivation is, what the motivation was when they wrote, say, the 14th Amendment. If you're going to try and apply the 14th Amendment to something else, okay, I get that. But to say that somebody just didn't like transgender people, that's why this law is being put into place, so we're going to strike it down, is not good jurisprudence. It has nothing to do with liking people. It has to do with the fact that the president and Pete Hegseth think that in order to have a functioning military where people serve and give up some of their rights to do so, because you don't have all the rights you have as a civilian when you're in the military. You don't have the right to free speech in certain areas. You can't say certain things. You can't do certain things you can when you're on the outside. You give up some of that. Anyway, Trump and Hegseth are saying these people, while there may be exceptions, are generally going to be a drag on the military. They're going to cost a lot of money. They're going to be out sick a lot. They already have a mental delusion, and they're going to create problems with other people. There's going to be birthing problems. You know, where do you put these people? It's the same thing with gays in the military. It still is a problem. Where do you put somebody, a man who's attracted to other men? Do you put him with the men? I mean, you can't put him with the women. What do you do? Anyway, the opinion goes on to say the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment talks about the fact that, quote, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And this judge is saying that somehow this transgender directive is violating the Fifth Amendment rights of transgender people in the military. Newsflash, you don't have a right to serve in the military. We're thankful that people want to serve in the military, but most of the population cannot. I can't anymore. Disabled people can't anymore. People of certain ages, of certain physical or mental conditions can't anymore. And I think it makes sense that you don't want people on cross-sex hormones or getting operations on the taxpayer dime when they should be serving the country. They should not be in the military. And that is something that the president decides. All other things being equal, not a district court judge from Washington, D.C. Now, we'll see how the Supreme Court handles this. I assume it's ultimately going to get there. But I just think there are some people out there that don't understand what the military is about. They don't understand it's not an equal opportunity place. They don't understand you have to, well, I mean, she tries to say she understands this in her opinion, but then she just slaps it down by saying, well, yeah, but these people have a Fifth Amendment right. Well, we'll see how the court ultimately rules. I obviously think that the president and Pete Hegseth are correct about this. And by the way, she tries to say in her, Judge Reyes does, in her opinion, that she cites a amicus brief, a friend of the court, that ever since transgender people got in, recruitment has been up. Nonsense. Only since we stopped all the woke policies did recruitment go up. Most of the branches missed their recruiting deadlines or missed their recruiting goals. After President Trump got elected, even before he took office, one of the best months in, I don't know, was it a couple of decades in recruiting took place right after the election. So people are starting to have a renewed sense of patriotism, and they want to serve. They don't want to serve in a woke military where you got pronouns on. I mean, it's madness. The military is designed to protect people from evil, protect our nation from evil. It's not a social experiment. Anyway, I think the Babylon Bee can shed some light on this. They had a headline from last week. It said, federal judge appoints himself president. San Francisco, California. The Trump administration agenda was stopped in its tracks this week after a federal judge appointed himself the new president of the United States. There's nothing we can do, said legal expert. He's a federal judge. Sources confirm that Judge Mortimer Dithers of the Northern District of California granted himself all the powers of the executive branch in an emergency move to stop Trump. Last night, the Constitution appeared to me in a dream and told me to do this, said Judge Dithers. You can't argue with that. Also, my word on this is law because I'm a federal judge. President Judge Dithers has already issued several executive actions, including orders for Tesla to stop making cars, Elon Musk to punch himself in the face, and Trump to not move his head next time someone shoots at him. This is the bidding of your new leader, said Judge Dithers. So let it be done by the order of your new federal judge president. Trump later responded to the ruling on Truth Social by accusing the judge of looking like a potato. At publishing time, Judge Dithers had been unseated as president by a higher court judge who declared himself president instead. That's the great Babylon Bee, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know about you, but sometimes I read the Babylon Bee and I'm just laughing. And then I go to another site and I almost think the headline is another Babylon Bee headline. It's so crazy. And I have to catch myself. Oh, no, this one's true. So it is amazing. All right, let me get to a question or two here that you have put in. A gentleman wrote in, Manny wrote in, he said, on a recent documentary, a minister remarked that Christians would be the only ones to be resurrected. And if this didn't happen, the whole doctrine of religion would be wrong. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Manny. Anyway, you say, what is your thinking on this? And also, doesn't your ministry preach on Sunday? Doesn't your ministry preach on Sunday? Well, I'm not a pastor, so I'm not always preaching on Sunday. But sometimes, Manny, I do speak at other churches, and I am preaching then. In fact, I'll be at some churches coming up here. Where am I going to be? Let's see. Oh, I'm going to be this is going to be April 5th and 6th. The 5th, we're doing the Unshaken Conference out there in Calvary, Albuquerque. That's myself, Elisa Childers, and Natasha Crane. Then the next day, I'll be talking about If God, Why Evil at Calvary Church, Albuquerque. Actually, the Saturday night service on April 5th and 2 Sunday morning services on the 6th. So I'll be preaching there. Then I'll be at Xena Nazarene Church. That, I believe, is in Dayton, Ohio. That's on the 13th. But before I get there, I'm going to be at, let's see, where am I going to be? I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm actually going to be this Thursday, that's in a couple days, at Mississippi State University on the 27th of March. Then I'm going to be, Lord willing, at Sam Houston State. And that is going to be on the 8th of April. That's in Huntsville, Texas. That's a great school there that we've been to several times. So look out for that. Go to our website for more on that. That's the 8th of April. And as I say, then I'll be out in Ohio on the 13th. We'll be at Wright State University on April 14th. So that's what's coming up in short order. But with regard to the resurrection, I know this might come as a shock to some, but everyone's going to be resurrected. The only question is, where are you going to be resurrected to? Are you going to be resurrected to God's presence? That would be heaven. Or are you going to be resurrected to hell, which would be an absence of God's presence other than his judgment? That's your call. Everyone's going to be resurrected. The only question is to where. And by the way, Christianity is the answer to the problem of evil. If Jesus, or let me put it another way, if we had never sinned, Jesus would not have been necessary in the sense he wouldn't have had to come to rescue us. But since we did sin, the only way we can be rescued is to have an innocent substitute take our punishment on himself. And that's what Jesus does. He adds humanity to his deity. He comes to earth. He allows the creatures that rebelled against him to torture and kill him so he can take their punishment, our punishment, upon himself. That way he can remain just and justify those who have done evil, and we've all done evil. In fact, that's why Paul says in Romans 3:26 that God remains just and is the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Jesus is the only way because there's no other way an infinitely just being can allow unjust creatures like me and you to go unpunished unless he punishes an innocent substitute in our place. Where is he going to find an innocent substitute? Only in himself. So he takes the punishment for us. That way he remains just, and he also justifies sinners. So look, there's only two things you're going to get in the afterlife. You're either going to get grace or you're going to get justice. I do not want justice. I want grace. Grace means heaven. Justice means hell. All right. I had another question. I don't know if I'll have time to get to it this show. Well, I'll give a brief answer. This is a good question. Came in from, hang on here. Let me see if I can find it because I had it up here a minute ago, but then it went away. Might be from, yeah, it's from Fernando. Fernando writes in, and his basic question is, if you believe the earth is older than, say, 6,000 years, what do you do about the genealogies? Because the genealogies, the reason that people today who believe in a young earth believe it's, say, 6,000 years old is because they add up the genealogies in Genesis. And they say, well, the universe was created at 4004 BC. Okay, I think Bishop Ussher did this a number of years ago. The problem for that kind of thinking is that the genealogies clearly have gaps in them. In fact, I was looking at an article, which I'll put in the show notes because it's a very robust article. There'd be no way I could go through it here online. It's several pages long. But they show Joshua's genealogy and Moses's genealogy over the same period of time, essentially. Moses has 4 people in his genealogy. Joshua has over 10 over that same period of time. And there are other reasons to point out that the genealogies have gaps in them. And some of the genealogies, like the genealogy in Matthew, I believe is put into 3 sets of 14. For theological reasons. In other words, the genealogies aren't meant to be added up successively to come up with an age of man. It's not really the age of the earth. It's more the age of man, because there are gaps in them. And here's what Wayne Grudem says. You might know Wayne Grudem. He's got a systematic theology. He writes, closer inspection of the parallel lists of names in Scripture will show that Scripture itself indicates that the fact of the genealogies lists only those names the biblical writers thought it important to record for their purposes. In fact, some genealogies include names that are left out by other genealogies in Scripture itself. And then he goes on to talk about the genealogy of Moses. There's 3 different genealogies of Moses in Scripture. One is in Exodus 6, another is Numbers 26, and another in 1 Chronicles 6, and also 1 Chronicles 23. And there are different listings of these genealogies because of the purpose of the writer. It's not meant to be an exhaustive genealogy. It's also been pointed out that the words used, like begat or son of, can mean not just the literal son, but it can mean grandson, great-grandson, great-great-grandson, or descendant. Father can literally mean father, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, and ancestor. Begat or fathered is not limited to just the immediate generation, can also apply to distant generations. I'm reading from this piece now. It's a very long piece. But R.A. Torrey noted, quote, the word translated begot is sometimes used not of an immediate descendant, but of succeeding generations. Unquote. Further, son may be a literal son or a distant descendant many centuries removed. A good example can be found in Genesis 46:15, which enumerates the offspring of Jacob and Leah. Quote, altogether his sons and daughters numbered 33, unquote. A careful look at this genealogy reveals that the sons included multiple generations of sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons. As a result, the early Hebrew convention of including just the most historically important individuals in the genealogical record, coupled with the broad meanings of these words like son, grandson, that kind of thing, or begot, raise serious questions whether the Genesis genealogies may be regarded as an absolute chronology pointing back to a 6,000-year-old earth. The genealogies themselves provide a rationale for human origins dating earlier than 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Okay, there's a lot more in this article that, again, I will put in the show notes, but it's a very interesting question. It's a good question, Fernando. Thank you so much. And always remember, whether you believe the earth is young or the earth is old, first of all, when people ask me the question, how old do you think the universe is? I say I'm absolutely convinced that it's at least 63 years old. All right. I'll throw my mom in there. It's at least 87. Christians disagree over this, and they have their reasons, and you can argue it until the cows come home. I think the better evidence is that the universe is old. And I think if you look at John Lennox's book, 7 Days That Divide the World, there's a good case to be made for that. But I don't divide over that issue. If you want to think it's young and you think the Bible's teaching that, okay, fine. I think if you look at Genesis 1, you want to take a hyper-literal view of it. The heavens and the earth are created before the days ever begin. The heavens and earth, the universe is created in verse 1. Then you're talking about the earth in verse 2. How long did that take? We don't know. That's why Lennox says the age of the universe, the Bible leaves the age of the universe indeterminate. But regardless of that, when you get to heaven, God isn't going to say, did you think it was old or young? It's not going to ask you that question, okay? So what did you do with Jesus? All right, let's stay on the essentials of the faith. There is a God, you are not him. You're a sinner. Jesus came, added humanity to his deity, took your punishment upon himself, and by trusting him, you can not only be forgiven, you can be given his righteousness, and he's going to come back again someday to judge the living and the dead. Stay on the essentials, ladies and gentlemen. It's fun to argue, but don't divide over it. All right, friends. We got a lot coming up. Don't forget that we're going to be at these schools coming up here shortly. We're going to be at Mississippi State this Thursday. And then I'm going to be out at I keep forgetting about this event. I'm doing an event at Grand Canyon University on April 3rd with Lucas Miles, the president of TPUSA Faith. That's Charlie Kirk's organization. We're going to be out on the quad there in Phoenix on the 3rd of April. We just added that. That's why I forgot about it. So this Thursday, the 27th, we got Mississippi State. Then next Thursday, the 3rd of April, we've got Grand Canyon University in Phoenix. Then we have the Unshaken Conference in Albuquerque doing the services there. Then the following Tuesday, the 8th, we've got Sam Houston University. And then we've got the stuff coming up the week after that. It's all on our website, crossexamine.org. Just click on events, Frank Turek calendar. You will see it there. All right, friends, great being with you. We'll see you here next time. God bless.
If you're looking for solid answers to life's biggest questions, don't miss the latest episode of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeart, OnePlace, and Podchaser. Tune in, discover the truth, and share it with someone who needs it. Let's keep spreading the truth together.